Hello, dear YouTube viewers, I hope you're doing well. Okay, let's start our video. The train ride home had felt longer than ever, though he had spent the past 4 years waiting for this day. After long nights in dorm rooms and endless study sessions, he was finally coming back to the place that had always been his anchor, his childhood home. He imagined the scent of his mother's cooking drifting from the kitchen, his father's familiar laugh echoing from the living room, his sister rushing down the stairs to greet him. He pictured the living room exactly as it had always been. The old couch, the faded rug, the family photos on the wall, reminders of years that felt both distant and safe. As the taxi turned onto his street, a smile spread across his face. After all this time, he was finally home. But as the car pulled to a stop in front of the house, the smile began to fade. The driveway was filled with cars he didn't recognize, sleek, polished, nothing like the modest vehicles his parents had always driven. For a moment, he thought maybe they had visitors, relatives gathered to surprise him. Heart pounding with excitement, he dragged his suitcase across the pavement and walked to the door. He knocked, expecting his mother's warm face to appear, but instead a stranger opened it. A middle-aged man in casual clothes looked at him with mild irritation, as if he were disturbing a quiet evening. "Yes?
Can I help you?" the man asked.
Confused, the young man stammered. I live here. This is my house." The stranger frowned. "No, this is our house. We just bought it last week." The word struck like a slap. For a few seconds, he thought it must be some kind of mistake, a cruel joke, anything but the truth. He stared past the man's shoulder into the hallway. The furniture was different. The walls were painted a new color. Nothing was the same. The house he had grown up in, the one he had left behind just 4 years earlier, no longer belonged to him or his family. Unable to believe what he had heard, he staggered backward, dragging his luggage toward the backyard. Perhaps there had been some misunderstanding. Perhaps his parents had moved things out temporarily. But as he turned the corner, reality hit him harder than before. Cardboard boxes were stacked carelessly by the fence, some half-crushed under their own weight. His books spilled onto the grass, rain-soaked and ruined. A shattered picture frame lay on top of one box, the photograph inside bent and faded. His childhood belongings, clothes, toys, school trophies, were dumped like trash, exposed to strangers and weather. His throat tightened, and his hands trembled as he pulled out his phone. He dialed his parents again and again, but each time the call went straight to voicemail. Their numbers were switched off, or maybe they didn't want to answer. He felt the weight of abandonment sink in. A couple of neighbors stood at the edge of the sidewalk, whispering as they watched. Finally, one of them, an older woman he vaguely remembered, approached hesitantly. "Your parents sold the house very quickly. Hardly told anyone. One day it was theirs, the next day it wasn't. No warning." The words cut deeper than he could bear. His parents had not only sold the house without telling him but had left everything he owned outside like scraps for strangers to pick over. His chest ached with a mixture of disbelief, sadness, and fury. How could they betray him like this? The place he had always thought of as home was gone, erased, as if his years there had never mattered. He stood there among the broken boxes and scattered memories, feeling more abandoned than he ever had in his life. He spent the night in a cheap motel room, staring at the ceiling and replaying the shock over and over again. Sleep never came, only a restless tossing that left his chest tight and his mind burning. By morning, he was determined to find them. They couldn't have disappeared without leaving a trail. After calling an old neighbor, he finally learned the truth. His parents had moved into a rented apartment across town, smaller and more modest than the house they had sold. The address was scrawled on a piece of paper that trembled in his hand as he set out to confront them. The building was nothing like the home he remembered. Stained concrete, narrow hallways, peeling paint. It smelled of dampness and neglect. He knocked on the door, his heartbeat quickening, and when his mother finally opened it, her eyes widened in shock. For a fleeting second, guilt flashed across her face, but she quickly looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice strained, though he already pushed his way through the doorway before she could answer. His father sat on a worn sofa, watching television with the sound turned low. When he saw his son, he straightened, frowning as if bracing himself for the storm. "So, you found us." His tone was flat, not relieved, not apologetic, just defensive. The young man dropped his bag by the door and stared at both of them, his voice cracking as the words finally burst out. "How could you sell my house? Everything I owned, dumped in the yard like garbage. Do you know what it felt like to come back and see strangers living there?" His mother's lips trembled, but she said nothing. She sat at the edge of a chair, hands folded tightly, her eyes fixed on the floor. His father leaned forward, folding his arms across his chest. "It was our property legally," the older man said, his tone clipped and sharp. "We didn't need to ask your permission.
We needed the money."
End of story. The words stung like knives. "End of story," he echoed, disbelief flooding his voice. "That house wasn't just yours, it was mine too. It was where I grew up, where my entire life was. You sold it like it meant nothing." His mother finally whispered, her voice fragile but cold. "You're grown now. You don't need this place. You've been away at university for years. It was time to move on." He stared at her, mouth falling open. "Time to move on?" He pointed toward himself, his voice rising with each word. "Move on from my memories? From everything I ever knew as home? You could have told me. You could have called me once. Instead, you let me come back to find my childhood tossed into boxes on the street." The father shook his head impatiently, as though scolding a child. "You don't understand real life. You think everything is about feelings, about memories. But sometimes we have to make hard decisions. This was one of them. You'll see one day when you're older." The young man's fists clenched at his sides, his whole body shaking with rage. His voice broke into a raw, unfiltered cry. "That house was my childhood. You erased my life, without even asking me. You didn't just sell a building. You sold my memories, my safety, my sense of belonging. Do you even realize what you've done?" His words filled the cramped apartment, bouncing off the walls, but his parents sat unmoved. His mother still wouldn't look at him, and his father's face remained stiff, as though he were listening to a child's tantrum rather than the heartbreak of his own son. The silence that followed was heavier than any shouting could have been. He looked at them one last time, searching desperately for any sign of remorse, of recognition, but found none. In that moment, something inside him cracked, the realization that the bond between them had been severed, perhaps beyond repair. Without another word, he grabbed his bag and walked out, the door closing behind him with a final, echoing thud. The rift between them had widened, and he felt, for the first time in his life, like an orphan not by fate but by choice, his parents' choice. The motel room smelled of stale smoke and disinfectant, its thin curtains letting in the yellow glow of the streetlight outside. He sat on the edge of the bed, surrounded by the same cardboard boxes that had been left out in the yard. They looked out of place here, crammed against the peeling wallpaper, reminders of a life that no longer belonged to him. He opened one box at random and pulled out a cracked photo frame. Inside was a family picture taken on his 12th birthday, him grinning with a crooked cake in front of him, his mother's arm draped loosely around his shoulders, his father standing stiffly beside them. The glass had shattered, a jagged line cutting across their faces. He traced the edge with his finger, feeling the sting of memory more than the sting of glass. That night he tried to sleep, but every creak of the building, every shout from the parking lot below reminded him that he had no place to belong anymore. He wasn't a son returning home. He was a stranger, rootless, clutching at fragments of a past that had been sold without his consent. Loneliness crept in like a cold draft, wrapping itself around him, pressing on his chest until he could hardly breathe. For the first time in years, he felt truly abandoned, as though even the ground beneath him had been pulled away. On the third day, he couldn't take it anymore. He packed what he could carry and went to visit an old friend from high school, someone he hadn't seen much since leaving for university. When the door opened, his friend blinked in shock, then broke into a wide grin, until he noticed the suitcase and the exhaustion on his face. After hearing the whole story, The friend's expression hardened into disbelief. "Wait, your parents really threw you out like that? They sold your house without telling you?" he asked, shaking his head. He nodded, ashamed to even say it aloud. "I came back and strangers were living there. My stuff was in the backyard. They didn't even bother to call." "That's insane," the friend said firmly. "Families fight, sure. But this isn't normal. They treated you like you don't matter. You deserve better than that." The words landed softly, a strange comfort in the chaos. His friend offered him a couch to sleep on for a while, and though it wasn't much, it felt like more than his own parents had given him. At night, they talked quietly, the way old friends sometimes do when the world outside feels too sharp. His friend told him, "Maybe this is your chance, man. Maybe you don't need to hang on to people who don't value you. Maybe this is about you finally standing on your own." The thought lingered long after the conversation ended. He found himself drifting back to memories of the house, the smell of fried onions in the kitchen, the echo of laughter during birthday parties, the warmth of sitting by the fireplace on cold winter nights. He remembered hiding under the dining table during thunderstorms, safe because the house had always felt unshakable. But as he looked closer at those memories, he realized the warmth had always been more about the walls and less about the people inside them. His parents had been emotionally distant for years, loving in duty, but rarely in presence. This betrayal hadn't created the distance. It had only revealed what had been true all along. One evening, sitting cross-legged on his friend's floor, he whispered to himself, "I have to rebuild from zero. On my own terms. No one else will do it for me." It wasn't a plan yet, just a seed, fragile but real. But for the first time since stepping off the train, he felt a glimmer of control. His past might have been sold away, but the future was still his to shape. The thought didn't erase the pain, but it steadied him. For the first time in days, he felt like he could breathe again. He signed the lease with trembling hands, the pen feeling heavier than it should have. The studio apartment was barely bigger than his old bedroom, a single room with a kitchenette shoved against one wall, a tiny bathroom, and a window that looked out onto the side of another crumbling building. The paint was chipped, the floorboards creaked, and the heater rattled whenever it kicked on. Still, it was his. For the first time in his life, no one could take it from him. The first few weeks were a blur of exhaustion. He picked up 2 part-time jobs, one stocking shelves at a grocery store in the mornings, the other waiting tables at a small diner late into the night. Between them, he barely made enough to cover rent and groceries. He learned to count every coin, to stretch pasta and rice into meals that could last 3 days. Sometimes he went to bed hungry, other times he fell asleep on the couch still wearing his work uniform. But when he woke up, he felt a spark of pride. The struggle was his struggle, and every small victory, every bill paid on time, every meal earned by his own hands, was proof he could survive. One night, as he sat on the floor eating from a chipped bowl, he whispered to himself, "This is my life, and I decide how it goes now." The words tasted strange at first, but repeating them gave him strength. No matter how much he struggled, at least he was free from the betrayal that had crushed him. Weeks later, a letter arrived in the mail. The handwriting was unmistakable, his mother's. His chest tightened as he tore it open. "You'll understand when you're older," the letter began. "We did what we had to do. Life is complicated, and sometimes decisions are made for survival, not for sentiment. We hope you won't hold it against us." He read the words again and again, but they only deepened the bitterness in his chest. We did what we had to. That was all his life had been reduced to in their eyes, an equation, a transaction. They would never truly see the damage they had done, never recognize that they hadn't just sold a house, but had cut their own son adrift. For the first time, he felt something clearer than rage: acceptance. They were who they were, and nothing he said or did would change that. He folded the letter carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and tucked it into a drawer. Not because he wanted to keep it, but as a reminder. A reminder never to beg again for the love they withheld. If he was ever going to build a life worth living, it had to be one rooted in self-worth, not in the fragile hope that they might one day love him as he needed. Slowly, He began to find people who filled the empty spaces his parents had left. His old friend, who had given him a couch when he was homeless, kept checking in on him, inviting him over for meals, and introducing him to new circles of friends. At the diner, an older cook named Ray took him under his wing, teaching him tricks to make food stretch and offering advice about life. Family isn't always who you're born to, Ray told him one night while they cleaned up after a long shift. It's the ones who stick by you when everything falls apart. He carried those words with him. Week by week, his network grew. A neighbor upstairs dropped off leftover soup when she cooked too much. A coworker offered to help him fix a leaky faucet in the apartment. These small acts of kindness piled up, thread by thread, weaving a new kind of family around him. One evening, as he sat in his little studio with laughter from his friends filling the air, he realized he felt more at home than he ever had in the house his parents sold. There were no family portraits on the wall, no childhood mementos lining the shelves, but there was warmth, loyalty, and a sense of belonging he had never known. He finally understood. Blood might tie people together, but it didn't guarantee love. Real family was chosen. It was the people who stood by you in your lowest moments, who stayed even when they had no obligation to. And for the first time in his life, he felt he had found exactly that. The months rolled by, measured not by family dinners or holiday gatherings, but by late shifts at the diner and the rhythm of bills slipping under his apartment door. Life wasn't easy, but it was his, and that made all the difference. He was beginning to feel settled into the routines he had built when, one evening, his phone rang with a number he hadn't seen in months. His chest tightened. He let it ring twice before answering. Hello. On the other end came a voice he hadn't expected to hear, so fragile. His mother. Please come visit, she said, her tone trembling. Things aren't the same without you. For a moment, he couldn't speak. He had imagined this call in countless ways. Angry shouting, bitter accusations, endless excuses. But instead, there was only weakness in her voice, and exhaustion he didn't remember. A moment later, his father spoke too, sounding older than he remembered. We miss you, son. We made mistakes. He agreed to visit once, but his heart stayed guarded. The apartment they now lived in was quiet, filled with the faint smell of dust. His parents looked smaller somehow, as though the choices they had made had weighed them down. His mother reached for his hand, but he pulled back gently. Their eyes carried guilt, but guilt alone wasn't enough to erase what they had done. Sitting across from them at the worn kitchen table, he listened as they stumbled through words of regret. Yet as he watched, he realized that though they might have begun to understand their loss, they would never fully grasp the depth of the wound they had caused. For him, it was too late to undo. The trust had been shattered, and no apology could piece it back together. When they finally asked if he could forgive them and come back into their lives as before, he took a deep breath. His voice was calm, steady, free of anger but firm with resolve. I'll respect you, he said slowly, but I won't allow you to control or betray me again. What you did hurt me in ways you'll never understand. I can't live my life waiting for you to change. I've already started building something for myself, and I won't go back to being dependent on you. They said nothing at first, just lowered their eyes. There was no shouting from him, no revenge or venom, just dignity. It was a quiet kind of victory, the kind that came not from breaking others down but from standing tall within himself. For the first time, he wasn't the boy begging for love. He was the man who knew his worth. After that day, he didn't return again. He answered their calls occasionally, spoke with politeness, but the bond they had severed would never be the same. He grieved that loss, but he accepted it. Some doors, once closed, are not meant to reopen. Back in his studio apartment, he stopped by a small shop on the way home from work and bought a new keychain. It wasn't fancy, just a simple silver piece with a small engraving of a tree. When he clipped it onto his apartment key, he felt something shift inside him. The house of his childhood was gone, but this place, however small and imperfect, was his home now. The keychain was a symbol, not of what he had lost, but of what he was creating, a future shaped by his own hands. That night, as he stood by the window looking out at the city lights, he thought back to the boy who had arrived at the house weeks earlier, suitcase in hand, full of hope only to find his world shattered.
He was not that boy anymore.
He had lost his past, yes, but in the wreckage, he had uncovered a strength he hadn't known he possessed. They sold my house, he whispered to himself, but they couldn't sell my spirit. I lost my past, but I found myself. And in that quiet moment, he realized that the greatest home he could ever build was not made of bricks or wood, but of dignity, resilience, and the certainty that no one, not even the people who should have loved him most, could take away who he had become. Thanks for watching. For more videos, please subscribe our channel. Awesome visual story.